Hey folks, so we have video and messaging disabled right now. We'll explain how to ask questions. We just were a little bit concerned about cyber attacks, unfortunately. So right now, everyone can't unmute or type in the chat, but we do have a function for asking questions. And when the president of the student union gets here, she'll kind of introduce you all to the event and show you how to ask questions. So just give us a couple minutes and then we'll get started.
Is Mr. Nader ready?
I think so.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Ralph. So I can't make it so that you like your picture's not in there at all.
Oh.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
So with that, we'll get started.
Okay.
Good evening, all. Welcome to a very special event. My name is Hannah Tate, and I am the president of the University of Regina Students Union. And we're really excited and hope that this type of event can be an annual tradition at the University of Regina Students Union. We're going to be spending this evening hearing from consumer advocate and considered by many the conscience of North America, Ralph Nader. Before we start, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. The University of Regina Students Union is physically located on Treaty 4 lands. These are the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. URSU represents members from all across Turtle Island and around the world. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. Ralph Nader has achieved a great deal. He first burst on the public policy scene with his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was a bestseller in 1966, and whose research and critiques of safety in the auto industry led to the introduction of mandated seatbelt legislation in 49 out of 50 states, as well as the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Act. Mr. Nader also took on numerous other issues, from consumer safety around various products to nuclear waste regulation to recycling programs and bottle bills that provided refunds for the return of plastics and recyclable materials. He was also credited with numerous bills related to transparency and anti-corruption in the American political system. Mr. Nader went on to found numerous public advocacy organizations, including public interest research groups, or PIRGs, just like our very own RPIRG. He also founded the Center for Study of Responsible Law. This work led to many different programs that helped shape policy in many provinces and cities, in particular around recycling, environmental safety, and building the rights of everyday citizens. He has inspired many generations for decades. And to this day, even with this event, we have heard of the impact Mr. Nader had on local politicians and members of our community. Before we get started, I would like to thank my URSU team, our executives, management, board, and of course, our members for this great event. I'd also like to pay a special recognition to our general manager, Talha Akbar, for being a driving force behind this event. He truly demonstrates that one person can start something big and make change. Thank you very much. And so just some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please email nader@ursu.ca and we will get to as many questions as we can. With that said, it is an honor for URSU to introduce Mr. Ralph Nader. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that introduction. And thank you, Muhammad Akbar, and others who made this possible. We're live streaming now from the only law museum in the world, the American Museum of Tort Law. Tort comes from the French, means wrongful injury. It could be crime in the streets. It could be crime in the corporate suites. It could be pollution. It could be hazardous products. It could be defamation. And it's unfortunate that we're not taught about this in high school, not to mention college. It should be part of the liberal arts because millions of people are wrongfully injured and don't know what their rights are in the civil justice area. They require the state to criminally prosecute, but they don't know that when the state doesn't do it or can't do it, there's a parallel remedy, suing under civil justice, Canadian, US courts. In our country, we have a constitutional right to trial by jury as well. And so you can take a virtual tour anywhere in the world of the Tort Museum by going to tortmuseum.org. And as you tour it, ask yourself why it wasn't part of our public education. So I want to start by indicating that one day, way back years ago, I realized that after taking on General Motors and getting the federal government through Congress to regulate the auto industry and establish mandatory safety standards and mandatory standards for pollution control, and that was quite some time ago. It's the 55th anniversary now of Unsafe at Any Speed, the book General Motors tripped over. And we moved from almost uniform congressional opposition to regulating this giant industry to a unanimous vote, with perhaps one exception, in the Senate and the House in September 1966, where President Johnson had a signing ceremony at the White House and had me as one of the guests. Just think, it took just a few months after the publication of this book to do what now takes years, such as getting the kind of Medicare in the US that you have in Canada, everybody in, nobody out. Now, it's often fashionable for reformers to spend a lot of time on all the injustices. And clearly you have to preface your remarks with a scenario just to provide a background. But I don't want to spend that much time. I want to spend more time on how and what it takes to change things. And surprisingly modest and simple, especially when you look at what it took to change things in the past. As we know, we have to understand all justice movements start with one person, and then they two, and then 20, and then 50, and then it spreads, becomes a movement. It starts with one person who does not say, I don't matter, I don't count, I'm just one person. Therefore, defeating that person inwardly for the duration. And that's pretty widespread. That lack of self-significance, that is the essential prerequisite for being an active citizen. It starts with your civic personality. It's not enough to know what's wrong. It's not enough to know how to remedy the wrong. You have to have a special civic personality, confidence in yourself without arrogance, willing to share the credit, continually staying up to date with the knowledge that is the firmament for your advocacy, and onward. Basically, protecting yourself from being burnt out or discouraged or more prone just to throw in the towel and give up. Civic personality is very important. You know, there's some great basketball players, and Jordan was considered one of the best in the NBA. But there were a dozen players who had his physical skills, but nobody had quite his mental concentration and will to victory. Nobody quite had as intense an athletic personality in the final minutes of a close game. Wayne Gretzky had that kind of athletic personality in addition to his skills. So a quick scenario. Our countries have far more injustices and problems than we deserve. On the other hand, we have far more pilot programs of justice here and there and solutions on the shelf that we're not applying. Example, we're a fossil fuel saturated 2 countries, from the tar sands of Alberta to the oil wells in Texas. And yet we know it's destroying the earth. Global warming, climate disaster, very much connected to greenhouse gases. We know that. We know that there are spills all the time. We know that there are occupational hazards all the time. That's pollution all the time. Yet on the shelf, straight from the sun, comes solar energy, solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, wind power, tidal power, and of course, such mundane things as clotheslines instead of electrified dryers. We know all that. Ancient Persians used passive solar architecture in the way they vectored their buildings. East Africans used wind power off the sea, funneling in centuries ago to cool themselves. We grew up looking at Dutch windmills. It's been around a long time. The sun is not going to go out of business. It's good for another 4 billion years, we're told. And it's free. And that's its problem. It doesn't immediately make money for concentrated corporations. It isn't concentrated, it's everywhere. It's decentralized. You can catch it on your roof. That's one of the problems. It doesn't lend itself to monopoly or concentration. So it takes democratic forces to unleash the benefits of solar energy, which stimulates local self-reliance and reduces the risk of geopolitical wars, and on and on. Healthcare. Think of all the preventive health measures we have, some of which are applying here and there. One is called exercise. One is called good nutrition. One is called be wary of pharmaceuticals and addictive drugs that don't work. One is called keep your eye open for a clean environment and take on the polluters, whether they're in the atmosphere or whether they're in the workplace. There they are. We have plenty of solutions there. They're on the ground, but they're not fully diffused. In our country, we don't even have universal health care. I've written an article comparing Canada and the US. Not just that you have a little card, a Medicare card, and that's what you show to get health care anywhere in Canada. You're not stuck in some narrow network of doctors and hospitals, as so many are in the US, but it affects the whole quality of life. So I've written an article which the Toronto Star published some years ago called 25 Ways Life is Better in Canada because of the health insurance that you have and the nightmare, complex benefit denial, corruption, overpriced healthcare that we have in the US. In the US, 100,000 or more people die every year because they can't get diagnosed and treated in time. And you can imagine how many injuries and illnesses are in that category. In Canada, unless there are a few exceptions, nobody dies because they can't afford health care. They have it at the moment of their birth or before. So we have the solution in Canada. It's not perfect, but if you compare it to the US, we better pull it down stateside much faster than is now being approached by a recalcitrant corporate indentured Congress and White House. So again, we have that. The same with education. Education is two-row. It's telling students in so many ways, memorize, regurgitate, and fossilize your minds. It doesn't allow for enough imagination for preteens, for example. It's too much standardized testing, too much standardized thinking. And yet we have schools that do it differently. We have books that talk about how to change the conversation with children and their parents so that small routine talk, sometimes very boring, sometimes nasty, converts itself into exciting, intellectually imaginative ferment. And the children in the preteen are delighted. They're at the peak of idealism, and they have an extraordinary ability to respond to various intellectual stimuli. We need more of that. The Montessori schools broke ground many, many years ago, but we need to diffuse the good solutions that have already been proven on the ground. Waging peace instead of war. We don't know how to wage peace. Canada was once known as an international peacekeeper. They would be the mediators. Lester Pearson, Prime Minister. You had a group of people at the UN. Last I checked, you're down to one in terms of the peace advocacy area. You're in Afghanistan with the US. Had you been involved in the Vietnam War in the 1960s, I think you would have experienced no Medicare. In our country, we were pressing for Medicare for everybody, but Lyndon Johnson couldn't get through Congress because the Congress said the Vietnam War is creating too many deficits and is draining our treasury, and all we can have is Medicare for the elderly and some Medicaid for some poor people who have children, assuming they can qualify and fill out the forms. So again, we don't know how to have universal, affordable, accessible healthcare. Of course we do. It's not being applied. We don't know how to prevent wars. Of course we do. The Constitution in our country says only Congress can declare war. Well, why hasn't it declared any wars since World War II and let the president make war on his or her judgments? Why? Why is it our president's completely out of control, whether it's Democrat or Republican, all over the world? They have bases in over 100 countries. They start wars without congressional declaration. They start wars sometimes without congressional appropriation for the funds. They have black budgets in the Pentagon. We don't know how to change that. Now, here's the great lesson of democracy. First, it works. That's why so many people like it. The second, You have to make it work. That means you have to, as a citizen, spend time. And it's a good idea to learn how to practice democracy in school as part of your curriculum. You learn through student government how to practice democracy. It's hope. But the curriculum should graduate you learning voter skills, citizen skills, consumer skills, labor skills for labor rights, taxpayer skills. What do I mean by all that? I mean that the sinews of a democratic society do not start with the Constitution, do not start with laws, do not start with charters. They start with the spirit of people and their desire in their respective roles in life to provide the tributaries for the mighty river of democracy. I always like to use the Mississippi River, a mighty river worth trillions of dollars just in economic terms as it winds its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Where does it start? Does it start with the Missouri River, the giant tributary? No. It starts with a few tiny rivulets in northern Minnesota and Montana. And they form little brooks. And then the brooks form a stream. And the stream forms a river. And the river forms the tributaries. And they feed the mighty Mississippi. That's what a democracy is. A democracy is the net result of the degree to which each individual has an estimate of significance that says, as a taxpayer, I'm not just going to look at tax rates. I'm going to look at how functional the government is in providing the services and the protections that our taxes pay for. As a consumer, I'm going to be very discriminating, rejecting the bad, rewarding the good, based on informing myself, developing consumer skills, knowing what my rights are for my grievances, whether it's buying food, healthcare, energy, housing, or anything else that makes up the necessities and wants of life. As a voter, I need to spend some time finding out what the records of the candidates are, not just their rhetorics or slogans. They're very good at that, just as they're very good at forgetting about them when they get into office. But I'm not going to let them forget about them. I'm going to pass out the voting records on key issues and start circles of discussion with my neighbors, friends, and relatives. That's my duty. I don't care if no one else does it. I'm not counting how many do it like me before I start doing it like me. I'm just going to further my own duty and let the arithmetic run up after I try to persuade more and more people and connect with people like-minded who are doing the same thing. If you were asked, how do you become a skilled voter? Could you write an essay on that? Or are we supposed to just be Pavlovian specimens, knee-jerking to some biased rhetoric or some pontification or some manipulative slogan that makes us feel good? We need to know their rhetoric and then hold them by their rhetoric. We need to know their record and then hold them by their rhetoric. The same with the worker. There are workers in this country, $60 billion, they're not being paid. The pay is being cheated. $60 billion, and you say, the Economic Policy Institute in Washington came up with that study. By the way, anybody gives you facts, always, unless you know them, always ask them, what's your source? Anybody tells you the government can do this or corporations can do that, you say, by what legal authority? That's what the reporters should do, and they don't do that. They're often just official source journalists. So you want to take each one of these roles and live the life of these roles. And like the rivulets, they begin strengthening the democratic process. You know, democracy peaks and ebbs. You had a peak in the 60s, for example. Could you get Medicare through today in the provincial parliaments? I don't know. Is there a moment in time when Tommy Douglas led the way in Saskatchewan. You weren't preoccupied with the Vietnam War as we were. Think of that. Are you as good as your ancestors at their best in giving you the blessings that you've inherited? Are you going to be a good ancestor? What is being a good ancestor? It's having a long-range view, not just short-term gratification for a decent standard of living. It's having a public philosophy and handing the country to your descendants better than you received it. That actually comes from the Athenian Code of Citizenship, which paraphrased, since I don't know Greek, is, I pledge to leave Athens better off than I entered it. By the way, you know, in Athens, they had this concept of public citizen. That's people who got up in the morning, they didn't just care about themselves and the family. They tried to improve the metropolis in Periclean Athens. I mean, let's not sugar wash it. They had slaves, which they seized from their spoils of war against other city-states. But Athenian democracy as a philosophy was quite impressive. And I was told that the word idiot in Greek comes from people who were private only and didn't care about the community and weren't interested in being public citizens. The word idiot, I-D-I-O-T. So what do we come down to here? You know, we're dealing with crazy stuff coming up, artificial intelligence that could turn machines into self-perpetuating saboteurs of human welfare. Stephen Hawking himself and Elon Musk signed a letter warning humanity of losing control of their machines. We have artificially driven weapons being developed, like autonomous drones. We have genetic engineering, which could go out of control. We have nanotechnology, which could go out of control. There was a wonderful article in 2002 in Wired magazine by Bill Joy, who was the leading scientist for a software company at the time. And the title, you should look it up, it's online, was "The Future Doesn't Need Us." And he outlined artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology as three examples that are moving out of control: democratic control, accountability control. Later on, artificial intelligence may not be controlled by its own creators. So we have all this. What does it come down to? Okay, make a list of the 10 most serious injustices in Canada. Your own list. Ask yourself, how many people are working full-time in citizen groups to change them? Working on parliament, working on private vested interests, working on influentials who are not holding responsibility, working on the press, working on the educational system. Ask yourself the question. I'll give you an example. The US Pentagon spends more than half of the entire government's operating budget. That's what Empire does. And of course, when that happens, they don't have enough money to repair schools, bridges, upgrade mass transit, sewage, drinking water, the so-called infrastructure, libraries, community clinics. Now, the Pentagon's budget is unauditable, and they're violating federal law since 1992, passed by Congress, which says that you must present Congress with audible data so we can monitor your budget. And the Pentagon basically says, oh, it's too complex. We haven't got time to do it. And since 1992, they are a violator of federal law. Okay, so a lot of people have a stake in that turning around, because when you audit the Pentagon every year by a legislative body, you're likely to squeeze out huge waste, fraud, corruption, redundant weapon systems like the F-35 that Washington wanted to pawn off on Canada to help share the huge cost overruns of that boondoggle airplane, almost got away with it. And so that's what I mean by empires devour their own necessities, because they're blowing up places and spending all kinds of money overseas. Now you ask yourself, how many full-time citizens in Washington are working to change that around and make the Pentagon obey the law? Zero. They work on some corrupt contracts. They work on trying to get arms control, but yet not one group has emerged. You can have a mega millionaire have some purpose in life instead of, going to five-star restaurants and filling up and wondering what life is all about if you've made your hundreds of millions. Just a small grant could start a group that could leverage the entire country to get that audited. Why? Because if you do a poll, 95% of the American people would say yes if you said, you think the Pentagon should have an auditable budget reviewed by congressional specialists. There's no left-right divide on that. And the media would report it. So it's our obligation to develop a lot of small, highly leveraged citizen groups with public opinion behind them, knowing what they're talking about, and asking the question, okay, we've got the injustice documented. We got public opinion behind us, or it's rising behind us because we're informing them. And we're looking for the place that can change it. And more often than not, it's the parliament. It's the provincial and national parliament. In our country, it's the Congress. And I'll be nonplussed when I watch all these marches and demonstrations, usually on weekends, in the US and Congress and Canada. And they are full of very intent and informed people, great, sensitive citizens. And they're marching, demonstrating, posters, chants. Where does that energy go if it is not directed laser-like on the handful of decision makers to whom we have entrusted our sovereign party power in Ottawa and Washington and in our provincial and state capitals? It goes into the ether. And you know who knows that better than anyone? The politicians. All civic energy, if it's not going to exhaust people and lead to disillusionment and burnout, has got to have a trajectory all the way to the decision makers. There could be corporate executives, there could be labor union chiefs, they could be heads of citizen groups, they could be, more likely, our representative government officials and ministries. And so why don't we start there? Why don't we ask ourselves, you got all these universities and these two-year colleges. Are they teaching citizen skills? Are they teaching us to practice democracy, to drive for justice? Or are they just teaching us occupational skills, accounting, engineering, public health skills? Very necessary for the society and for a material, decent standard of living. But if we don't have civic skills, we cannot deal with the concentration of power that is endless in the hands of the few over the many. In every circle you can imagine, concentration of power, the antithesis of a democratic society, autocracy over democracy, led by plutocracy and oligarchy, often garnished with nice sounding banners and names and ideologies, titles. We know what the score is, however, and so do most of the people. But do they know how to respond? Do they know that it takes usually no more than 1% of active, informed people driving to remedy an injustice, knowing that public opinion is behind them, and focusing on the arena where the decision can be made to replace that injustice with greater justice? 1%. You know, you heard about the Wall Street occupying 10 years ago? Occupy Wall Street, 99%. The 1% run it. Well, my contention is the other 1% can overcome that 1%. 1,500 corporations pretty much running 2/3 of the members of Congress. How many votes do they have compared to us back home? 1% of the people in congressional districts, you call them ridings, that's 2.5 million people. Let's say they have a congressional hobby and they call themselves Congressional Watchdog, District 38, New York State. And they marshal together 1%. That's all. I mean, I think there's more than 1% of the people work in bridge clubs. I'm amazed how intricate bridge is and how dedicated they are, and the contests and the communication. Or bird watching clubs. I've often said if we had as many Congress watchers as bird watchers, we'd have a great democracy. So people do have their hobbies. So how about a hobby on Parliament? A congressional hobby on Parliament, or a Canadian hobby on Parliament. 1% or less. We turned Congress around to regulate the auto industry with less than 1,000 people around the country in the 1960s, because we had the rest of the people behind us. They wanted safe cars. They wanted to protect their families. They wanted their defective cars recalled. That's where it all starts. A few. Now at the universities, you have great assets. You always want to start when you're dispirited and you talk about all the apathy. Most people don't care about changing things. They're inward looking. Just ask them, do you know what your assets are as citizens? For heaven's sake, you got the vote. That's one. You outnumber the capitalists, the corporate capitalists, the big guys. You got workers. You outnumber the vendors, big vendors. You got consumers. I mean, just band together in a variety of ways. Well, in universities with student government, you can band together. And that's what student government is to begin with. It's a banding together. But why not band together to get the curriculum to have courses that teach you how to practice democracy, learn the theory, learn the great historical examples like Tommy Douglas and what he started, how they started cooperatives in Canada, and then learn the actual experience, connect with the community, get course credit for interning with community, citizen groups, or at parliamentary levels. And that's one. And the second is start your own citizen group. All you have to do is assess yourself a few dollars a year, and because you're large numbers, and you start a nonprofit tax-exempt group, and you call it, you have already one in Regina, a tiny public interest research group. You can have it much larger, spread it to other universities, Saskatchewan. We call them public interest research groups. They already have University of BC, I think, has it. There's one in Ontario, one in Quebec. They work the local levels. They're very modest, but the structure can be expanded quite enormously. You can possibly get some of your teachers to give you course credit, as they do with New York Public Interest Research Group, which has a $3 million budget and dozens of full-time staff. Barack Obama came out of Columbia and spent a few months interning with the New York Public Interest Research Group. He never looked back, unfortunately, but he certainly knew what it was doing. And thousands of youngsters have been trained civically and are now in their 30s, 40s, even 50s out of the public interest research movement we started in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They've worked on prison reform. They've worked on redlining against minorities in low-income areas in terms of housing, depriving them of access to mortgages and insurance, which dooms the area to further deterioration in the cities. They worked for voting reform. They improved the New York City budget, subways, all kinds of things all over the country. There are 20 states with these PIRGs now. They canvassed thousands of homes against water pollution, to diminish air pollution. Now they're doing climate disruption confrontations, solar energy. And look what they're learning. They should be learning this as part of their curriculum. Every course should have a civic dimension. You have engineering courses, okay. What are the professional codes of ethics of engineers? When do they have a right to be whistleblowers if they work for Boeing and Boeing tells them to shut up and they are forced to install a deficient software in the 737 MAX, which killed several Canadians and many more members of 38 countries, including my grandniece in Ethiopia, because engineers didn't know how to organize and say to their commercial bosses who were cutting corners, we're not going to allow this. We're going to go to the FAA. We're going to blow the whistle. You need us more than we need you, and you know it. And we have the way to make this plane aerodynamically stable. So every course should have a civic dimension to it to make you a whole personality, a whole human being, not simply a skilled person, working and thinking about the community. There isn't any of you that doesn't have something to contribute, whether it's from graphic arts to law, to healthcare, to simple conversational capability, communication, the media, you name it. Citizen activities don't require a ticket of admission, and you can't fire a citizen. So now all this has one more predicate. Readers think and thinkers read. Our young generation doesn't read enough. They spend too much time watching screens. And you know what that is. The iPhone, the internet, the Facebook, the emails, text messages. You know, you don't even get to the point of information before you're supposed to transfer it into knowledge, then move it into judgment, and then move it into wisdom. You're overloaded with bits and bytes. You got to fight that consciously and not let any peer group deter you. So I'm recommending one book we wrote with Duff Conacher and Nadia Milleron, 1993. It's called Canada First. That was inspired by Canadian audiences who could never get past 15 when I would ask them, tell us in your history where Canada was first. And you were first in hundreds of ways. First radio station, first undersea transatlantic cable, first cooperative, first children's museum, first in North America with Medicare. You taught us how to form credit unions when people in Quebec came down to New Hampshire. And now we have 80 million people who belong to credit unions all over the country. Dozens of examples in Canada First. The second is a book answering a lot of your questions in your age group about politics. It's called Civic Arousal. It's only about 70, 80 pages. And Muhammad Akbar and Hannah have them in the little library that you have there. It's a quick read, and it starts by reprinting a letter from a young woman and a young man asking me a few years ago, we want to do something, but we don't know quite how to do it. We don't know where to go. That's reflecting that their university education didn't quite prepare them to answer those questions, to become part-time public citizens. And the third is a book called Canada After Harper that was edited by the wonderful economist Ed Finn, bless his soul, who worked for the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, CCPA, in Ottawa, led by Erica Shaker. And there are 21 chapters on most of the major problems confronting Canada and discussing what the solutions and the remedies and the ways to diminish them or to prevent them in ways that are perfectly within the capability of Canadian knowledge, Canadian technology, Canadian law, and Canadian rights, if they're exercised and applied with a scale of priorities. So those are three. And I hope that in doing so, you'll show up. Half of democracy, by the way, is showing up. The other half starts with conversations. So when your student government, when Hannah and the general manager of the student union, Muhammad Akbar from Ontario and Ottawa, where he had good experience with students and is starting to get things underway to start public interest research groups. When they put the call out for a meeting, they may not have pizza to offer, but they have food for thought. They'll make your life better and more gratifying as you go through your decades in the future. And one that blends with others, like the rivulets moving to brooks, streams, rivers, building the mighty Mississippi. You begin transforming the country and the world, because you can start out with knowledge, wisdom. You know you have the mass of the people behind you, and no combination of corporations and government toadies can overwhelm the combined sovereignty of the people, organized on a daily basis on the ramparts, before the parliaments, in the courts, into town meetings, using all the levers to attain what one of our 19th century senators, Daniel Webster, once said, the great work of human beings on earth, justice. Thank you.
Mr. Nader, that was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
You mean it wasn't a credible presentation?
This was, I have chills. I'm still,
Okay.
I got chills. You know, it's always an honor. You know, the first time I heard you speak was when I was much younger in Brantford. And, you know, one of the cool things, and then I saw you speak in Ottawa, and now I'm here in Regina listening to you here. And each talk is very unique and hits a lot of different points that people feel in the zeitgeist, and it's as relevant today as it was when you achieved major victories around nuclear safety regulation, around auto safety, and around food security. I'm just going to remind the audience, if you have questions, feel free to post them to the email nader@ursu.ca. ursu.ca. Just because of some of the Zoom bomb threats that we got before this event, while the 99% of our feedback was positive, we got a few people, trying to disrupt the event. So we can't really share as much, but we will go through all the questions very shortly. And so feel free to start emailing your questions or comments for Mr. Nader. We'll start with this one. This is from Edward Pyle. How do we encourage a culture of safety in a province that traditionally tolerates risk and unsafe behaviors? For example, the low rates of COVID vaccinations in this province specifically.
Yeah, well, we rework our priorities from existing budgets. That's one. Budgets have to have moral strategies behind them, moral preferences. And I'm talking about public budgets of governments. And unfortunately, they attract rapacious, mostly corporate commercial interests that twist the budgets into their priorities, like handouts, bailouts, giveaways, subsidies, all the kinds of things now that they go to Ottawa and Washington for. At the same time, they brag about being capitalists. They turn government into corporate socialism, where they transfer their risks onto the government and they reap their private profits. So in the US, I want to give you a staggering comparison. Apple Corporation has bought back $380 billion of its stock in the last 6-7 years. They just announced early this year they were going to add another $90 billion in stock buybacks. Now, stock buybacks don't create a single job. They don't increase wages. They don't expand pensions. They don't engage in R&D. They don't provide money to deal with the recycling of toxic casted off Apple phones and computers, which is a terrible occupational hazard when they're being separated by poor people abroad. Now watch the comparison. Keep that 90 billion. That's one one company buying stock to increase its share earnings ratio, which just by coincidence is a metric for executive compensation increase, the bosses. Now watch. The budget for the UN is a little bit more than 6 billion. The budget for the World Health Organization is about 6 billion. The budget for the United States Environmental Protection Agency is a little over 9 billion. The budget for the Centers for Disease Control is 7 billion. The budget for the Occupational Safety and Health Agency in Washington is a mere 500 million. What we spend to support our embassy in Baghdad, by the way. The budget for the auto safety is about $1 billion, right? And the budget for the Food and Drug Administration, give or take, a couple billion. We haven't yet reached 45 billion, or half of what this overpriced iPhone computer company is wasting in 1 year. So don't let anybody tell you that government and business, oh, you can't afford this, Canadians. You can't put this into health and safety preparedness for future pandemics, so you're not caught flat-footed and hundreds of thousands of people die and economies are stilled with all kinds of other collateral suffering. No. I can give you examples with the Pentagon, which you would be staggered by how they're wasting money. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over a few years, just down the drain. The question is civic mobilization on public budgets. You don't just talk about an end point, contractual waste, not that. You go right to the core in Parliament. We want to have public hearings, and we want to take the Swedish example, which passes a law, appropriates money for national town meetings all over Sweden. And here's the question, and the citizens gather, and they deliberate, and then they feed it back to the members of Parliament in Stockholm. Why shouldn't we adopt that in the United States and Canada and then feed it back? There's plenty of money. The amount of money that's spent on corporate welfare in the United States every year, hundreds of billions of dollars. The amount of money in terms of tax loopholes, huge. The fraud of private health care companies on Medicare for the elderly in the US, 60 billion a year with a B. 350 billion Medicare healthcare billing fraud. In other words, we spend $3.5 trillion on healthcare, 10% is ripped off by computerized billing fraud and abuse, according to the government accounting agency of the US Congress and the leading expert at Harvard, Professor Malcolm Sparrow, Sparrow. You can look him up. So we have to reorder so that we put the priority on health, safety. That means not just health care, not just health insurance, but prevention of disease. That means going after junk food that leads to obesity, early diabetes, deliberate marketing of junk food and junk drink for the youngsters over the years have taken the obesity level in our country from 2% in 1970 to 33% today. Overweight, 2/3 of Americans. And I think the figure is similar for Canada. And we don't know how to deal with that? Of course we do. It starts with the schools and the families. It starts with banning that kind of advertising. It starts with exposing the dedicated marketing rackets where these companies undermine parental authority and discipline and direct sell to little children, turning their tongues against their brain with junk food and sugary drink, salt and fat in their diet. This is all a product since the 1980s. We can't change that? Of course we can. We just have to get more serious so we have more joyful lives. We get more serious, we have less hurtful lives. It's the old the old concept, greatest good for the greatest number. And it's the more pleasant. Justice happens to be a more pleasant way to live, doesn't it? So go to these grassroots. You got to start the local organizations, know what you're talking about. Don't end up in endless internal bickering and trivia. Keep your eye on major goals, something larger than yourself, and focus on the circles of decision-making that can change things around, like parliaments. And don't be afraid to go to the newspapers and magazines and radio and TV stations. Forget the text message. Say, I want to go down and talk to you, Mr. Editor or Miss Publisher. I want to talk with you. They'll say, what? Some reader, some viewer, they actually have input? I mean, look at National Public Radio in the US. It's 30 ads an hour. When we were pushing it through Congress, it was proposed to be advertising free, supported by a modest public budget. Look at it now. The Facebook, Google, Exxon, Pfizer, say that's because we let go of it. It's a good idea. And then it started degenerating itself because we let go of it. We were silent spectators.
Amazing. The next question is kind of related, so feel free, let's see if we can add anything to here. But there are a lot of debates on social media, seemingly with nothing being resolved and either side changing their view. Do you have a strategy for changing someone's mind? For example, a political opponent.
A political opponent, yeah. Well, first of all, you put on a little card and you say, here are the yes votes of the politician. Yes, 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 yes. And here are the no votes of the politician in Parliament, or what they talk if they're trying to replace the incumbent. Then on the back side of the card, you have the same issues are asked of the voter. So you start with the backside. You hand out these little cards, and you say, "Are you for or against the following?" Yes, 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 yes. No, 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 no. Right? And then you say, okay, turn it around. And suddenly the citizen sees that the politician is voting against. When the citizen said yes, politician's voting no. When the citizen said no, politician's voting yes. So you get them to take it personally, don't you? You get them to take it personally. Now, when people come into this museum, the law of wrongful injury, they are loaded with propaganda by Aetna, Cigna, and all the insurance companies that don't want to pay out part of the premiums that they get from you when people are wrongfully injured or they need health care. So they listen to the television ads calling trial lawyers ambulance chasers, and we're a litigious society. Not 2% of wrongfully injured people in our country ever see a lawyer. Just the reverse. The courts are underfunded. There are not enough cases in the court to deter bad performance on the part of other parties than the actual defendant who's being sued. So they come in this museum, and this museum respects their intelligence. It shows the historical cases that gave wrongfully injured people rights against corporations, government, just perpetrators, street crime, and drug companies, tobacco companies, asbestos companies. They're all exhibits like that. The Pinto fuel tank incinerator, the unstable Corvair, and so on. They're all, you can take a nice tour, tortmuseum.org. You know what? Whether they come in as conservatives or liberals, or they come in as propagandized by the insurance industry, they come out with a remarkable change of mind because they just look at the visuals, look at this description, the court cases, then they're asked questions like a law student. Well, what if this was 3 times the speed that was rolling down the mountain toward the home? What if this, that? And so they were stimulated. and they come out and it's unbelievable to see the transformation. There's nobody pounding anything into them. Wake up, idiot. Look at this. How dumb can you get? No, you just show them the historical evolution from medieval England to our early years and how we dealt with justice against the perpetrators of people's harms. So that's another way. You give them educational experiences and let them teach themselves. It's clear that most people who come to this museum, they hardly know what tort law is, when they should have grown up learning about the law that protects them, deters harmful conditions, and should be utilized. My father used to say, if you don't use your rights, you're going to lose your rights someday. We've seen that already. We haven't exercised our voting rights. Look how we're being suppressed in some states like Texas, purging voters, blocking voters, harassing voters, impeding voters, and then criminalizing volunteer precinct workers who give their time on election day, help count the ballots. I see we don't listen to Canada. You have these automatic voting machines with software owned by the companies, often whose CEOs are Republicans, for example. In Canada, isn't it true that you have a paper ballot? If you have a paper ballot, I was told that by midnight, you pretty much know who won and who lost in your provinces. Well, why in the world don't we listen and learn from Canada? You ought to send buses down here telling us about Medicare, showing how life can be better, telling us how you've simplified the voting process. You register voters at the census time. We have all kinds of obstruction of registration, even students. Oh, you go to Syracuse University? Well, you can't register here. You got to register from Brooklyn, where you live, or vice versa. Constant obstruction. You have a lot to teach us. Don't hesitate.
We do have paper ballots, so I will confirm that. The next question is foreign policy related. So what role do you see the US and Canada in geopolitical conflicts in areas such as the Middle East? For example, political conflicts between Israel and Iran.
Well, Canada was smart enough to stay out of the Vietnam War. It stayed out largely from the criminal war in Iraq that blew apart a country that wasn't a threat to us to this day. Death, injury, disease, destruction of public services, civil war, and all the rest that it gave rise to by the war criminals, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Clinically war criminals, The Justice Department to this day could prosecute them, but it's not likely to. So now Canada got involved in Afghanistan. Wrong. They should never have done that. First of all, we should have, after 9/11, had a multilateral force to pursue the backers of the attackers. That would have been perfectly acceptable under the UN Charter and international law. Instead, we decided to overthrow the government. The Taliban were given an award earlier that year in the US for stamping out the drug trade, the opium trade. They were willing to turn over the backers, but Bush and Cheney said, let's get rid of them all. Well, another burial ground for another empire following the British and Russian attempts in Afghanistan. And the Canadians got involved in that, which helped militarize Canadian policy, which increased the Canadian military budget, which made Canadians huddle with US military people to get them to buy US weapons that they would never need and use. They were offensive weapons that were not properly within any kind of national self-defense priority. So on the Middle East, you should never get involved with the US-Israeli alliance to suppress the Palestinians. The peace movement in Israel has never had a chance to testify before a congressional committee since 1948, not once. Now, the peace movement has been headed by generals, mayors, Israeli mayors, former ministers of justice, leading intellectuals, very prominent people. Never were given a voice. It was always the militarists, like the US militarists. And that affected Middle East policy all over and suppressed a lot of dissent. Now, the Palestinians didn't ask to be occupied. They didn't ask to be militarized. They didn't ask to be embargoed. This is a result of World War II and the Holocaust. And they were the recipients of what Hitler generated, in effect. And it affected our whole relations with the Arab countries. It led us to support Arab dictators, supported oppressing their own people. It destroyed any kind of democratic movements. And Canada should have no part of that. They should be peacemakers in the UN and elsewhere, just the way Lester Pearson would have been. Peacemakers, that's their role, not to be a toady to the US empire, and not just in the Middle East. Because there are interests in Canada, who benefit from a bigger military budget. Let's face it, it's big business. War is profitable to certain interests. But you should have no part of it. You have a tradition of being a peacemaker. You have peace groups in Canada, nuclear arms control groups in Canada. You have Quakers in Canada, bless their historic role. And you should develop supreme independence from the web of a North America military alliance. You're not going to be attacked by anybody in the world. This isn't like some 18th or 19th century situation where foreign powers have designs on your territory. You've got to be a leader for peace. You have the precedents for it, and that's the way to moderate the US. Don't underestimate the leverage you have over the US if our northern neighbor wages peace smartly, diplomatically, clinically, universally. You could have a real influence, just the way that your lower drug prices are used in the US to try to pull down our monstrously high drug prices. Your drug prices are higher than they should be because Washington under Bush lobbied Ottawa to weaken the controls. But obviously there are people who go from Buffalo to Toronto to get cheaper insulin and cheaper other drug prices. So give us a break, Canada. We haven't given you a break. That doesn't mean you have to be the same and stand aloof. Give us some of your benefits, some of your examples. One of them is to reassert your peace advocacy.
The next one, I'm going to read this one. It's coming from Kai, and they say they had a comment and then a question. So I used to run cross country with your niece, Nadia, in 1982 at Berkeley High School. Coach White used to always yell at us, Nadia, lower your arms. Kate, lift your arms. As Nadia always had them up and I always had them way down. I remember that as an image for bringing people together, finding the middle ground. Thank you for your talk. What do you think are the differences?
Your question, I didn't quite get it.
Oh, I didn't ask the question yet, but they just wanted to let you know about that, I guess, moment. So what do you think are the differences between citizen action in Canada and citizen action in the United States?
I think it's him.
Oh, no, it's not frozen anymore.
Yeah, we were cut off temporarily. Do you want to repeat your inquiry?
Absolutely. And let us know if it gets paused at all. What do you think are the differences between citizen action in Canada and citizen action in the United States?
Tala, I just got the end of it. We got cut off somewhere. You want to repeat it?
What do you think are the differences between citizen action in Canada and the US?
Well, in the US, we use the courts more. We have broader, in some areas, legal remedies and rights. Our tort law is better than in Canada. You don't have a guaranteed right of trial by jury, and you have caps on damages that we don't have, although we're starting to have. So there's more resort to the courts. The second is that in the US, it's harder to communicate with Congress. You know, in the Parliament, you have free postage. I understand that you can write a letter postage free to your MP. In the US, you have to pay postage. Traditionally, before the internet, that was not a minor thing. If you tried to get people to send thousands of letters, it added up. So you have that privilege. The third is you have a parliamentary system. And that is, if your party and your agenda wins, you're pretty certain that you have a majority or a coalition to get a bill through. In our country, that's just the beginning. The party, say, that wants universal health care could win, and then it has to deal with all the obstructions in Congress, including the notorious filibuster and the lack of discipline, and then the presidential veto. But you merge the executive and the parliament because your ministers, Minister of Transport, is also a member of parliament. So when you do win an election, you can get something done much faster than the agonizing process, if we can ever get anything done, should our party win, let's say, over a 2-year or 4-year period. So that's a very important difference where it's advantage Canada. The third is, I think you could develop checkoff systems better than we can. First in universities and elsewhere. In US, we have an obstructive, what I think baseless constitutional challenge that says you can't make people pay on a checkoff, blah, blah, blah. It delays things. So we lost a big battle in the Supreme Court, 6-3 in 1986, which prohibited state laws that said to electric, gas, and water companies, you have to insert in the billing envelope 3-4 times a year an insert that invited people to join a nonprofit citizen group that championed ratepayer causes. Well, the Supreme Court, in an absurd decision, said, oh no, that's because you can't do that because the Pacific Gas and Electric monopoly in California has a First Amendment freedom of speech right to remain silent and not be forced to reply to the message in the envelope. It's a total absurdity. It takes corporate personhood to levels of animism never thought up by anybody in world history. And Justice Rehnquist ripped the decision apart as a dissenter in the 6-3 vote, but we lost. And that eliminated the incipient organization of thousands of consumer groups with full-time staff. In the banking area, there would have been an insert in the bank statement once in a while, monthly. In the insurance industry, in the utility industry, and even in the rental industry. And it was all wiped out because of that Supreme Court decision. That would not happen in Canada.
Okay.
By the way, you have stronger union rights as well. You're far more unionized. I think you're 30% unionized, and we are now 7% unionized. We have very obstructive anti-union laws, such as the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And the Democrats and the unions haven't really made a coordinated effort to repeal it since then, part of the weakness of the Democratic Party, even when they were in charge of the Congress.
The next question is, what is the most important advice you would give to parents trying to raise children who will continue to be good ancestors? It's especially tough during the pandemic survival mode we are in to stay connected to community. How do we keep kids from falling into despair or becoming apathetic to government misleading and priorities?
Well, first of all, I repeat my mother's point when she would tell young parents in a technological age do not be afraid of your children. I mean, children are very strategic. If they know they can use certain gadgets and the parents don't, and they can get around certain disciplinary standards, they know how to do it. And parents often coddle their children and spoil them because they're afraid of what their children can do to themselves or go off with a bad crowd. You've got to anticipate that and foresee and forestall it. The second is have serious conversations with youngsters. Not this, there's so much silly talk. You know, all families have it, but you can take it to an extreme. We were raised in a family where we were admonished with Arabic proverbs. My parents came from Lebanon. So when we misbehaved, we didn't hear my parents say, "Stop it, shut up, you'll be sorry, we'll get you," and slam us against the wall or whatever. They would cite a proverb. Now, you know, a proverb, it's been tested over the ages, right? It sort of respects our intelligence, right? It's very succinct. It's been working for years. So when we get too rambunctious, you know, out comes the Arabic proverb. Well, you see, we have American proverbs. We have Italian proverbs, Jewish proverbs, Chinese proverbs. You know, go to the wealth of the culture here, too. The third is consider the following. We thought we were trained in our schools, educated at home, and excited by our local library. 3 pillars to the stool that we grew up from. And so the parents should recognize that the schools are only a small part of educational development. And for example, the parents have certain skills. The kids don't even know what the parents do because they never talk about it. Mommy, what do you do as a lawyer? Daddy, what do you do as a plumber? What is an electrician? What do you do as an accountant? They grew up not even knowing. And if they knew more of that, they would learn some of these skills. They'd learn a little plumbing, a little carpentry. That's part of education, learning about the crafts and the artisans, learning to respect blue-collar people without whom this country would go to the grinding halt. The white-collar people get more prestige, but the blue-collar people keep the country running. Yeah, you know, try getting rid of people who pick up the garbage, or the home health care people, or a whole list of blue-collar people, some of whom are getting praised now during the pandemic. Nurses, nurse practitioners, nurse assistants, pulmonary specialists, and so forth, risking their lives. So it's very important to have the home culture be vibrant. And then we had books full of shelves. We had a big brother who was a wonderful big brother. And when he got out of the US Navy in 1946, he loved encyclopedias. So he bought a whole set of the Americana encyclopedia and brought it home and put it on the shelf. He was so proud of it. And so he got his 2 sisters and little brother together, and he said, "You should start reading this. You know, just pick a letter in the alphabet, P, W, X, B, just leaf through it." And we said, "Oh, Shaft, that's wonderful. And it's great that you brought these books." And then he said, "One exception." We said, "What?" "Don't believe everything you read." So he said, "What do you mean?" So he turns to the section on Hawaii. And the section on Hawaii says that the Hawaiians invited the US Marines to take the country, to take the island. And he said, that's not really what happened. The white planters who owned the great plantations overthrew the queen, the native queen, and invited the Marines to take over and replace the native peoples. So he said, this encyclopedia has a lot of good stuff in it, but don't believe everything you read. He was 19 years old. How did he come with such youthful wisdom? Because he was raised by a mother and father who had good conversations at the dinner table. They asked when we ran home and said, what'd you learn today? Well, we learned who discovered America and who. We said, Christopher Columbus. And my father said, sit down, son. He said, Christopher Columbus met a lot of people when he invaded America for gold. And he slaughtered a lot of people. That's a lesson you don't learn in school in those days. And so the real educators of children are the parents. And the result of their education is they teach children that their best teacher is themselves. Children's best teacher are the children themselves, stimulated and directed and encouraged by the family and by good teachers and good libraries. That's the seed corn of all democratic justice pursuits. And if you want to know more about this, I was asked once where I came from. And so I put out with my siblings how our parents raised us in a small industrial town in Connecticut, where at one time there were 100 little factories and shops producing everything you could imagine. Now they're almost all empty, moved out to other countries. And the book is called 17 Traditions. It's 17 ways they raised us, starting with learning how to listen. That was the first way. Learning how to do your chores, learning how to study, and learning how to be civically active, learning about charity. And that'll elaborate, I think, the question that was just asked. It's called 17 Traditions, Harper Collins, its publisher. It's online.
It's a really good segue into the next question. So somebody asked us to link some of the books we talked about. So I'm going to link to your website, nader.org/latest book has a list of your latest books. There's also Canada First, Civic Arousal, and Canada After Harper, which you can Google. And you can also email us for more info. I own many of these books. Are there any other ones you want to mention, Mr. Nader, for the crowd on books they should?
Yes. Nonfiction exhortations haven't worked very well on Congress. So I published a fable, How the Rats Reformed Congress. And it starts out with a fictional surging of rats from the catacombs under the Congress because they smelled food, a lot of parties, a lot of things dripping off tables and so on, garbage. And they drove the Congress people crazy, running around trying to escape. They brought in the National Guard, the Army, and so on. And it became great news every night. People all over the country who never focused on Congress, weren't interested in Congress, to hear the latest. How were they taking care of the rats? And the rats were in the offices and up the toilets and, creating all kinds of spectacles, and multiplying themselves because of the food that's there and so forth. And then a small number of people watching this said, look what the rats are doing. What can we do? And so they started getting together, led by a stonemason, recently retired out of the Midwest. And the rest of it basically is, here's how you take control of Congress. Here's how you do it. And it's full of practical advice. It shows great tension and drama, how to get certain allies and crowbar your way inside Congress, huge rallies 24 hours a day with bullhorns around Congress, using free speech, organizing back home, all kinds of techniques, strategies. It's only about 230 pages. I'm trying to interest people in making it a movie. Fantagraphics in Seattle put out a new edition. Unfortunately, it came out in the middle of the pandemic, so all the promotions were canceled. And they gave it a new title, And it said, "The day the rats vetoed Congress." There's great art in it. So it's online, and it's a great way to make yourself, to have yourself laugh yourself seriously. It's a functional use of humor. You laugh yourself at the beginning, jolting episodes, rats coming up, toilets, you can imagine what that resulted in. And it's clinically accurate, by the way. Rats can come up toilets. And then it becomes real. And you can see how the swelling movement from around the country, people dropping their sense of powerlessness, their cynicism, and they start mobilizing around agendas that are long overdue. And they learn that the way to get through Congress a lot is to do it fast at the same time before the corporate lobbyists can regroup. President Harry Truman proposed universal health care in the 1940s. We don't have it. It came in piecemeal, Medicare, Medicaid, here and there, VA. And the more time it gave the corporate interests to retaliate, to control, to bleed off, to get subsidized, the less likely universal health care was going to occur. It gave them too much time. The great breakthroughs in reform in our country were done in matters of months. They may have had the predicate laid for a long time, but once the legislation was introduced, you got to do it fast before there's a turnover, before the corporations can hustle up more pressure on the politicians and propaganda on the media. Go to nader.org. You can sign up for my weekly column, which has been written since 1971, free. You get it automatically. For every 100 people who have said yes that I've said this to, when I go back and ask them, 5 signed up. People are overloaded. They got to stop being overloaded. And in this case, it takes 7 minutes a week, 7 minutes a week to get agitated, encouraged, equipped. That's what the purpose of the column is. And I have a podcast, the Ralph Nader radiohour.com or .org, every week where I put people on who don't get voice, who don't get visibility. And you can learn a lot from that. I learned a lot from that. It's been operating for 5.5 years. Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We get actually more proportional feedback from Canada than we do from the US, proportionally. Could be because I talk a lot about Canada.
And we just linked the YouTube channel in the chat. Almost 20,000 subscribers. It's pretty amazing. And we've got nader.org. So if you just go to the latest book link, you can just go to nader.org. And all of the columns are archived in blog format, which is super helpful. Okay, so the next one, this comes with a bit of a comment before the question. So Roseanne says, "Thank you for your great talk. We have your mom's cookbook. It Happened in the Kitchen by Rose B. Nader and Natra Nader. Last time you were in Regina, I had you sign the cookbook." So the question, yeah. And I'll forward you these emails with personal anecdotes. Oh. Sorry, did it stop working again? Sorry, folks, we'll give it a second. I'm sure it'll start working in a second. Oh, there we go. And you're back.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
It's always when we give you the anecdotes. Yep, it's always when we give you the anecdotes. Okay, so the individual mentioned that they have your mother's cookbook and you signed it for them last time you were in Regina. And for folks who are sending the emails, we will send these personal anecdotes to Mr. Nader. So how does one get the attention of politicians who are not listening to science or experts in the field?
Well, I have something called the summons. Now, most politicians have town meetings, and when they got a lot of feedback they didn't like, they started telephone town meetings instead of auditorium town meetings. But whatever choice they make, they set the agenda. So I have a summons written in the book breaking through power. It's easier than we think. And on page 140 or 141, it's online, is the formal summons. Whereas the Congress has ignored this, whereas the Congress has blocked that, where is the Congress, where is the Congress? Now, therefore, we summon our senator or representative to come at the following date, mutually convenient, at the following place, the town hall or school auditorium, for a town meeting of our making, an agenda of our making, in order to explain our demands and receive your response. No intermediaries, no staff, no flack. Now, in the United States, turning out for town meetings by members of Congress is so notoriously low that it would take no more than 500 people to get a US senator and probably 300 to get a US representative. It's a big country. That's all it takes. Especially if the petitioners, if the people who send the summons, and it's sent formally, show the senator and representative that they're not going to take no for an answer. If they are busy that day, set another day. If they want a more convenient locale, fine. If they want more people to sign the summons, fine. That's basically saying to a politician, you're not going to wear us down. You're not going to delay us out because we're just going to redouble our efforts. So you better respond on the first round. It's amazing. These elected officials are using the sovereign power of the people under the Constitution. Starts we the people. Doesn't start we the corporation. It doesn't start we the Congress. It starts we the people. Because we're a republic, we delegate our sovereign power to our elected officials. And they dare turn it against us on behalf of some paymasters from Wall Street to Houston? How dare they? We should never allow that to happen. 1% organized, reflecting public opinion, you send these corporations scattering. We did it in a number of places, starting in the 1960s when people were a little bit more awake. 4.2 million lives. You see that? Unsafe at any speed. So do not think anything is overwhelmingly difficult and unassailable. It's easier than we think. We have historical examples proving it in Canada throughout the decades and in the United States and all over the world. The best way corporations have to defeat you is when you defeat yourself. When you don't have a higher estimate of your own significance, when you don't parcel out a little time throughout the year for your civic pursuits and your civic duties. So now, there are all kinds of manuals how to make Congress put their voting record on their website. Do your members of parliament put their voting record on their website? Okay, if they don't, you certainly can make them. There's no argument against it. That's a slam dunk. Go to democracywatch.ca, run by Duff Conacher. You'll see how he monitored the banks in Canada so they weren't as reckless in 2004, 5, 6, and couldn't bring down the economy the way the banks in New York did, which didn't have a democracy watch on them. And he got a lot of media, still does, Duff Conacher. He's in Ottawa. And he has all kinds of bills in Parliament to make members of Parliament accountable. And he's passed a few of them. So connect with him. Democracywatch.ca, have a virtual speech and exchange with him. He'd be very happy to do so. I think he's taught some law courses at the University of Toronto, and he's getting a PhD from the University of Ottawa. And he's a great civic leader. He has a tremendous sense of priorities and leverage, so tap into his experience and wisdom. It's Conacher. I think Muhammad Akbar has met him, and he knows about the PERG movement and has encouraged it in earlier years.
Yes, amazing. And we linked the website and his name in the chat. Absolutely amazing individual and activist. The next question is from a faculty member who thanks you for the honor to listen and see you in real time. Would you please share some advice on how to start a university-wide conversation about attending to our civic energy and civic rights obligations, especially regarding faculty members who are tasked with influencing the next generations of citizens and professionals in all walks of life?
Well, I think it starts with a public petition and declaration. You know, our country started with the Declaration of Independence. So you got to frame it with major significant range and depth. So the faculty gets together and they say, look, of course we have to have a curriculum where we train students for occupations and professions, whether the liberal arts or the what they call the hard sciences. But we have to have a civic dimension. We have to have a department of civic practice. Now, there are universities who have public policy departments and centers. There's one, as I mentioned, University of Western Ontario. I think they're all universities. But I'm talking moving from policy to practice. We have Department of Civic Practice, where the students get actual life experience off campus for credit. They connect with the courses and classroom and then move into off-campus subjects where faculty and civic leaders come together and continue the process. Learning by doing, as John Dewey, the great educational philosopher, would say early in the 20th century. You should read some of his very, very useful still tracts on education and how to make it meaningful in people's lives after they graduate. That's one. So you have a declaration. And then you look at the curriculum and say, every course should have a civic dimension. Philosophy should have a civic dimension. What is a civic dimension? Well, that's what the faculty work on. We know what a civic dimension is in the science and engineering courses. We've written books on it. It's developing a profession, not a trade. What's the difference between a profession and a trade? A profession is one is it has a learned tradition. It has independence and a tradition of public service. Now, I'm not going to downgrade plumbers compared to material engineering people, but plumbers just fix plumbing. They're not metallurgically concerned people. That's not their job. But a metallurgical engineer has got to tap into a learned tradition. He's got to tap into independence from corporations that try to abuse engineering knowledge for safety and durability and efficiency, like the fossil fuel industry or the chemical industry, and a tradition of public service. That would include whistleblowing protection and going to the professional engineering societies who have codes of ethics to defend them. It's a little more challenging in the humanities, simply because it hasn't been given much thought, because humanities are so broadly gauged with the intellect. But it's not hard to have civic dimensions. To people like Descartes and Immanuel Kant, and in the other literatures, the ancient Athenian plays, Shakespearean plays lend themselves very good to civic dimensions. I'm talking about civic values in contrast to commercial values. Every major religion over 2,000 years ago warned its adherents, do not give too much power to the merchant interest in those days. Do not give too much power to because if you do, the monomaniacal pursuit of profits and economic personal gain collides and overrides, undermines, and weakens broader civilized values. We, talk about under words like morality, justice, tolerance, against discrimination, respect for future descendants, and so forth. So when the auto companies didn't have to deal with civic values, they decided who lives or died. They didn't put seatbelts in cars. They blamed drivers for everything. And they kept all kinds of engineering remedies that you now have in your cars, taken for granted, on the shelf. While millions died or were injured every year all over the world. You're still having to bring them kicking, that's what this is about. That's the next chapter of motor vehicle safety. There's a lot of unfinished business, and the auto companies are still fighting it, even though, they put in the early safety features and they made better money and they saved some of their customers' lives, but they're very, very narrow-minded, and that's what commercial mercantile values were. That's why every major religion had a caveat, a yellow sign of warning on it. And to this day, we need to take courses on civics, where it's entirely on civics, but all the other courses should have civic value dimensions. The faculty know how to do that. They just have to free themselves, stop self-censoring themselves. There's a reason for their tenure. It's called intellectual freedom, a little bit of boldness. And too many faculty are very conforming. They get very comfortable. Tenure then becomes just the opposite, becomes a foundation for a sinecure. So you have to rethink the whole educational endeavor, get the best from the past, pilot projects here and there, 1930s, 1960s, so on, and move forward. Because a society without an educational foundation of yeast to invigorate it is not going to be a society for self-renewal and one that can foresee and forestall. We have a lot to foresee and forestall. Just look at climate, look at pandemics, look at the elected dictatorships, elected autocracies. Yeah, they go to the polls, but the choices and the selections end up with autocratic mentalities, like is now in countries like Hungary and what Trump tried to impose and so forth. So I don't know what a greater gratification there is in pursuing justice. It's just nothing can compare with life's quality, except for raising families and having wonderful kids. And peace in the world is part of justice. You know the old phrase, peace and justice, they go together. So I have no idea why people don't have a higher estimate of their own significance and quickly give up on themselves and say, who am I? I'm just a person. I don't matter. Or they just get very cynical. In academics, societies, cynicism is a mask for pretended intellectual savvy. I don't need that. That's a lot of junk. Cynicism is not skepticism. Skepticism is critical of status quo and moves forward. Cynicism is rejectionist and withdraws, gives up under a mask of savoir-faire. Doesn't work. There are two ways to go through life. One is to believe everything, and one is to disbelieve everything. And they both end up in a bad way. So it only takes a few faculty to wake up the rest. The trouble is that those few faculty occupy the same table in the cafeteria. They talk to themselves too much. In the 60s, the students who were really active against the war for women's liberation and civil rights, Black Power, and all the other slogans and so on, there were capsules for justice movement. They had teach-ins. They actually sought out uninformed fellow students, uninformed or people who were sort of just wanting to get a diploma and leave. And they didn't persuade huge proportion. They got to the 2 and 3% though. That's all they needed. because they knew they were backed up on a lot of passive support by a larger majority. But you've got to talk to people who may agree with you once you discuss it, may disagree, you change their mind, may disagree, you don't change their mind. 2% is not that much.
So, just for context, folks, it is about 11 p.m. where Mr. Nader is. We have 3 questions left. We'll try and get through them, but if you need to leave, please let us know. This one's a quick one. How do you keep your cool when so much is unfair? Here in Saskatchewan, fertilizer use increases yields and profits, but is killing birds and ecosystems. But it's hard to tell a farmer to not buy fertilizer. It's a big business. So how do you keep your cool when so much is unfair?
Well, there's a lot of regenerative agriculture developing. There's a lot of organic agriculture developing. There's a lot of reduce the need for these kinds of pesticides and fertilizers. A huge amount of practical experimentation all over the country that ends up with the farmers markets or food on your table. Wendell Berry, look him up, Berry. He's a farmer philosopher in the Appalachian areas. He's written a lot of books, and he's gone all over the country, and he's got a website. So, and I'm sure there's someone in Canada, more than a few people. Talk to David Suzuki. He'll tell you all kinds of ways to answer that question. Listen, you got a lot of innovative people in business that don't get enough attention. There's so much attention to the big corporations, and they get a dominance which it makes people become subservient. Like you can't fight Exxon, you can't fight Google, you can't fight Facebook, you can't take on the big hospital chains. Well, there are examples where that has been done successfully. We have a small business in my hometown called Media Bids, and it was a success. And then Google started, moving in. The giant Google, right? A flick of its tail, and they thought they would eliminate this business. Well, guess what? Media Bids did it better, and Google withdrew from that line of business. Who would have thought? So we got to get the best out of people. The reason why people like democracy is because it gets the best out of people. The way people hate autocracy is they get the worst out of people. Trump got the worst out of the American people. He unfurled the worst, and he set an example for the worst. And the Democratic Party didn't have the fortitude and the resoluteness to send him into oblivion in 2016. I mean, the Democratic Party is supposed to represent working families. They can't landslide the worst Republican Party in history. Cruel, vicious, Wall Street indentured, warmongering, ignorant, lying. The early Republicans, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Senator Robert Taft, they wouldn't believe what was going on in their party now, the GOP. So it's up to more parties and more citizens taking over parties. But back to the agricultural area, there's awfully wonderful things going on in Africa, Asia, South America, North America. You just have to have civic groups that diffuse these best practices faster. We don't diffuse them. You have some bad behavior by the entertainment media. It goes right through, and all kinds of teenagers emulate it, sniff it, whatever. But like TikTok, but we got to have citizen groups that diffuse best practices. Oh, this jail allows education for the inmates. Well, why not other prisons? Works in this prison.
So next question is around organizing around climate change on a global scale. Like, how would you do it? And then there's a specific question about whether you think it's favorable or a good idea or necessary to tether emission standards to trade deals between nations, which is something folks have proposed.
I didn't get the last part of that
Oh,
question.
uh,
Do emission statement, what?
Tethering emission standards to trade deals between nations.
Oh, well, we have to have a much broader conversion. This is a historic conversion. It's got to be done fast, which is reducing fossil fuel use, replacing it first with conservation that isn't pointed out, huge jobs, retrofitting buildings, community after community, schools, homes. A megawatt of energy you don't waste is a megawatt of energy you don't have to produce, or a gallon of energy you don't waste, a gallon of energy you don't have to produce. And Canada and the US are the two biggest energy wasters in the world by far. They could get along on 20% of the energy they're using now. We had an engineering conference in 1973 where the engineers came in and they actually said that then. We have saved a lot of energy, Canada and the US, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, but we have a long way to go. Look at our motor vehicles, look at our refrigeration, heating systems, very wasteful. We don't have enough passive solar to begin with. So we have to have a conversion, and everything else accelerates in terms of its subparts. So we have a trade policy that converts, we have a tax policy that moves to renewable. We have a local cooperative, self-reliant, local wind power, for example, local solar industry, roof panels. It can move very, very quickly. These projections are not going to make it, like 50% renewable by 2050. We can't wait. The scientists, the meteorologists, they can't keep up with their predictions because every year gets worse and worse and worse. Something very multiplierly bad is happening. And as the permafrost melts, it becomes a perpetuator on a multiplying level, for example. So, you know the old story, when mankind abuses nature, nature is extremely resilient, and it's abused more, and it's extremely restorative, and it's abused even more, and then it turns on its abusers with a savagery that an inanimate phenomena can only exhibit. Just take a look at the floods and all, at the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the drought, the sea levels, and see what we have to do in terms of infrastructure investment. And of course, all jobs, good jobs, but we have to take some of this ridiculous, overpriced, over-profiting corporate stock buyback money and tax it until you tax it out of existence. It used to be a violation of our federal security laws. It would be called insider trading until Reagan abolished it in 1982. Now they're all doing it. And $8 trillion since the year 2010 has been burned by corporations with stock buybacks. $8 trillion. And the Republicans are saying 3.5 trillion over 10 years for infrastructure is too much. That's 350 billion a year. I mean, do you know what a big bridge costs these days? For example, we just got the cost estimates of building a seawall around Miami. Yes, they actually have city evacuation plans for Miami Beach, relocation. But the wall around Miami is $5 billion, the seawall. And they're talking about $350 billion when they give trillions of dollars of tax escapes to corporations and the super wealthy. Who gives them? The Congress. Who's the Congress? 535 people who put their shoes on every day like we do. Why do we let them get away with it? Because we're otherwise preoccupied? We don't have time? We don't have the know-how? We're too busy with being drained from our work and spending our leisure hours at some entertainment, watching screens? What's our excuse? Stop making excuses for ourselves. That's the main intellectual plutocracy. We make excuses for ourselves. When our forebears, a fraction of them, put everything on the line, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and others, they put everything on the line to make it better for us years later. We should be ashamed of ourselves. We can turn the Congress and Parliament around in a matter of months with the summons. Keep that in mind. We summon them and take back our sovereign power and reorient it, reprioritize it, invigorate it with such fundamental social values that it receives left-right support. And these ridiculous red state, blue state things dissolve when the issues come down from their abstract, ideologically manipulative levels and relate to where families work, live, and raise their children. Where they live, work, and raise their children. You have less ideological schisms because whether you're conservative or liberal, you really want your kids to be toxified? Do you want them to go to rundown schools? Do you want to be given jobs insecurity? Do you want to be underpaid, underinsured, disregarded, disrespected? Do you want to have public services deteriorate? Do you want to have your money go to wars of aggression overseas? What do you want to do? It's up to you. It's in your hands. Along with the Canadian maple leaf, there should be another visual. It's in your hands. It was in our hands. People live every day when they used to die. You can't believe how little effort this took. But it was focused, knowledgeable, persistent, and laser-like on the members of Congress who did the job to begin turning it around. A lot more to be done, but we have fewer people now working on auto safety than we had in 1968. See, there's no excuse for it. I went up to northern Massachusetts to tell a little story because the spare parts for the Corvair, you believe it, there's a Corvair Club of America. They have like 7,000 members. They have conventions. They trade parts. There's a Corvair in the museum. You can see it on tortmuseum.org. So I said to myself, where are these parts coming from? The last Corvair was 1969, for heaven's sake. And they're still trading cars and talking Corvair talk. So I discovered that there's one supplier, major supplier, all kinds of parts. And it was in northern Massachusetts. So I went up there. There are 3 giant Quonset huts. The couple, elderly couple, they've been with the Corvair a long time. They had 28 employees. Their catalog was this thick. I kid you not. This was 5 years ago. I looked around and I said, how many people are working full-time as citizens advocating safety in Washington, D.C.? They were fewer than 20. Why should we be discouraged when we don't have our team on the field? Why should we be discouraged? That's a source of optimism. Hey, look what you're doing with a few people. Why don't you quintuple it? So that we've got to learn from history, learn about civic organization, banding together, tactics, strategies, be innovative. What was the last citizen innovation? I mean, we've been protesting and demanding for centuries. Then we litigate. Then we have initiatives and referendums. Then along comes the internet. Tell me, has the internet made the citizen movement stronger? It certainly informed people. When indigenous peoples in Canada get together and US against these pipelines and so on, it's good to have the internet. But overall, have we really broken through with new techniques, new ways of motivating people, mobilizing people, organizing people? laser focusing on the power structure, taking it apart, deconstructing it, replacing it, displacing it, renewing it, disciplining it, making it more accountable. We outnumber them fantastically, the 1%, to put it in a simplified manner. So you have to read. Please read, students. You have to read the social justice movement history, how people overcame tremendous odds, made it easier for you, better for you, and then carry forward. Joy and justice is what I called my Green Party campaign. Joy and justice. Some of our campaign workers said, I know about the justice. Where's the joy? As they worked their heads off. I said, you'll see. The answer was, we didn't see, because we had an exclusive, rapacious two-party duopoly that in the most anti-democratic way kept us from giving the American people more voices and choices. And the media went along with it. Well, we laid some groundwork. We gave them some agendas. We had some young people become introduced to a lifetime of civic pursuits, political pursuits. That can't give up. You got to have another round. Same in Canada. You don't have it as bad. You have more people on the debates for prime minister, for example. You have more political parties. You have your problems for sure, but you've got to keep saying, how do we renew democracy for the 21st century? We have an 18th century constitutional system that is obsolete in many, many ways. The word corporation or company doesn't exist in our Constitution. The words political parties don't exist in our Constitution. Well, how come they dominate us? See, that's one of the first questions in a civic course. You don't just memorize phrases from the Constitution. We need upgrading democracy like we need to upgrade infrastructure and public services. Tremendous intellectual challenge. Don't let anybody tell you, including in law schools, that technical law is the most challenging, technical analysis. No, the most challenging is normative law. How to create justice, extremely intellectually challenging. Far more than trying to understand a technical tax loophole in the code. By the way, our internal revenue code and regulations are over 6 feet high. Canada is like a foot. You have a complex economy. How come you only have a foot? We have 6 feet. Your Medicare law was 13 pages. National Medicare law, 13 pages. Obamacare's amendment of our complex healthcare laws was 1,800 pages, on top of others. See how much you have to teach us? Bring the buses down, Canada. Come on, we'll help you out. Come on down from Vancouver, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, even Prince Edward's Island, which I understand has its measure of comedians. Come on down. Come on down. Don't be so modest. Carry Canada first with you. Educate us. We'll be welcome. People like Canadians. You look like us. Stop being so reticent. You'll also learn some things we've done that are better.
This is amazing. I think we'll wrap it up here just because it is a bit over time and we do want to give you some time. I'm going to give Hannah an opportunity to give some closing remarks. And then I think there are some ways we can go from here that I'll kind of pass to the crowd.
Somebody come in?
Oh, yeah. Hannah's going to give a closing and then we're going to go from there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nader. Did I lose you?
Oh, he'll jump back in a second. It cuts in and out.
Can you come in?
Oh, you're in.
Okay, listen, I have one more story. About
Yes.
35 years ago, roughly, we commissioned a young woman to write a book on women activists. Unfortunately, she just passed away. But she went around the United States and England, and she interviewed women who never were activists, but they were challenged in their community by a nuclear plant in Michigan, by a chemical plant in Appalachia. And they decided to stand tall. They weren't waiting for anybody else. And they began to be more and more expert and more skilled. And they got into tremendous controversy. And they developed a lot of support. And of course, their husbands were telling them, you can't continue going on this way. You're neglecting your household. So there was family tension. In England, they were picketing around the clock nuclear bases that the US and the UK government were maintaining and wanting to expand nuclear arms. You've probably heard of that movement. And so she interviews them, she documents what they went through, and then she writes a book called Women Activists. She comes back to our center. And I sat down with her and our colleagues, and I said, what was the singular impression that you come back with after studying all these activists? You know what she said? I never met happier people. Just look what they went through. Calumny, degradation, defamation, tension, attacks, sexism, household tension. The beautiful pursuit of justice melted it all. I never met happier people. Pick up the book, it's online, Women Activists. Go to nader.org, sign up for the column, listen to the podcast. What am I doing this for? It's for you. And if you look at screens, text message, I just heard of a 16-year-old who text messaged 300 times in one day, back and forth. I was constrained to say, what's the rush? What's the urgency? Disentangle yourselves. Give yourself time. Start reading, thinking more, planning the life you want to lead. It's not just a good material standard of living. It's not just raising a good family. You should be so lucky in these times. It's being part of the great movement for a just world. We don't have that many centuries left. If only the sun could speak to us and tell us everything it gave us. The exquisite genetic biodiversity. And what are we doing with it as the dominant animal species? My phrase now to the American people, you know how I sum it up? I've done my share of exhortation. I've done my share of people giving me standing applauses and then drifting away back to their apathetic routine. You know what my phrase to them is now? Americans, wake up. The only thing you have to lose is your dreams.
Once again, inspiring stuff. And I'm going to ask Hannah again to jump in, and then I'll give a closing because I do want to mention a couple things. This province has a lot specifically that can be done, and so we can get into that. But feel free to go ahead, Hannah.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Nader, for your dedication to people and society. And thank you very much for sharing your insights this evening. You have touched millions of lives with your work, and millions more have taken action because of what you stand for and your long-lived passion for pursuing social justice and civic education. I really appreciated your kind words about Canada. Your vision and lofty goals are extremely inspiring. As a student union, we do see a variety of huge systemic issues that require civic education, civic empowerment, and civic action. And as you previously mentioned, students have led big changes in the past. So just for the students in the audience, I wanted to let you know that URSU's by-election nominations close this Sunday. So there are open board positions and an open VP external position. So check out our website or social media for more details. And as URSU's president, I can personally guarantee that a lot of what we spoke about tonight will be a large focus of your job if you are successful in the election for the board or for the VP external position. URSU is ready and willing to challenge the status quo and build a better future for today's students and tomorrow's students. We have a special focus on environmental action, social justice, anti-poverty, anti-oppression, reducing the costs of education, improving working standards for students, uplifting the voices of marginalized groups, and much more. You, as an individual, have immense power, and this by-election could be the first step of many for you to positively impact society. If I learned anything tonight, it's that one person taking one step can make dreams a reality. So on behalf of our members, thank you very, very much, Mr. Nader, for an informative and inspirational evening. And back to you.
Thank you. And in just closing, remember, the students were in the forefront of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, big time in the United States, Earth Day, 1970, tremendous legislative enactments in the following 2 years, women's rights movement. Listen to that history. Read about that history. You can do as much, if not better, standing on their shoulders. Leave a strong civic institution behind at the universities and two-year colleges. Call them public interest research groups, call them what you will, but leave full-time positions supported by students advocating justice in your province and in your country and in your world. Now, I might add, if you don't like the quality of food taught in the schools, you don't like the quality, change it. We've had students change the quality of cafeteria food to greater nutrition. It's good to learn about these things while you're there at the university and then expand that applicable knowledge after you graduate. Thank you. Anyway, thank you for staying so long. And we're constantly willing to help and answer your inquiries, as Muhammad Akbar knows. And stay in touch with Duff Conacher and other PIRGs in other provinces. Have a national reunion of all the PIRGs, which has never happened. The whole is often greater than the sum of its parts. Thank you.
Thank you. And something for the participants, faculty, students, and staff that has happened when Mr. Nader usually gives a speech or a talk at a university, it results in action. A lot of the PIRGs that were created, a lot of the institutions that we come to value in Canada were created because Ralph did a talk somewhere and people got inspired. So what we're going to do following this is we're going to reach out to all the folks who registered for this event. And if you want, again, you can reach out to the email we created for questions. Just reach out there if you want to get involved. I'll post in the chat again, nader@ursu.ca. And let's see if we can build some public interest movements around Saskatchewan. We've already started talking about PIRGs, so there's going to be some developments on the PIRGs, I think, and some meetings happening on that. But there's many opportunities. Alberta has Public Interest Alberta. There's a variety of different organizations that take on this work that we can work together to build. So if you want to get involved in building something bigger, please email us or wait for the email to come to registrants. Thank you all again for attending.
Okay. Thank you.